this December the 4th. And one of the things I'm going to try to do as Poet Laureate, when I give readings, I'm going to try to read a couple of poems that are not by me. So I'm going to open and close with poems that are not by me, and then read you guys a few poems in the middle that I did actually write. And this first one is, I feel like if I can get through a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins, because they're often such tongue twisters, I can get through whatever else I need to do. So this is going to be my attempt to get through one of his more difficult tongue twister type poems. But if you don't know Hopkins, he was a Jesuit priest in England, in England and Ireland, the late 19th century. He wrote poems kind of secretly. They weren't published till 30 years after his death, and he sort of made up his own rules for poetry and prosody that I don't think anyone could figure out besides him. But this is one of my favorite poems of his, and it's called "That Nature is a Heraclitean Fire and of the Comfort of the Resurrection." Cloud puffball, torn tufts, tossed pillows, flaunt forth, then Chevy on an air-built thoroughfare. Heaven roisterers and gay gangs, they throng, they glitter in marches. Down rough cast, down dazzling whitewash, wherever an elm arches, shive lights and shadow tackle, in long lashes, lace, lance, and pear. Delightfully, the bright wind, boisterous, ropes restless, beats earth bare of yester tempest creases. In pool and rut peel parches, squandering ooze to squeeze dough, crusts, dust, stanches, starches, squadron masks and man marks, treadmire toil there, foot fretted in it. Million fueled, nature's bonfire burns on. But quench her bonniest, dearest, to her clearest selved spark, man, how fast his fire dent, his mark on mind is gone. Both are in an unfathomable, all is in an enormous dark, drowned. O pity and indignation, man shape that shone sheer off, disseveral a star, death blots black out, nor mark is any of him at all so stark, but vastness blurs and time beats level. Enough, the resurrection, a heart's clarion, away grief's gasping, joyless days, dejection. Across my foundering deck shone a beacon, an eternal beam. Flesh fade and mortal trash fall to the residuary worm, world's wildfire leave but ash. In a flash, at a trumpet crash, I am all at once what Christ is, since he was what I am, and this jack, joke, poor potsherd, patch, matchwood, immortal diamond is immortal diamond. So if I could get through that, I can get through, my own poems, which should be much easier to read. This poem is a good winter poem, and I actually wrote it on the morning of January 6th this year, before everything that went down in the afternoon. And so I've kind of been unsure what to do about it, but kind of as we head back into the winter time and the anniversary of that, I'm going to leave it kind of as it was on some level. It was about something more personal to me, the loss of my father, who died almost a year ago. But it's because I wrote it on that morning, it's taken on a weird other significance too. So this is called The Feast of the Epiphany. Winter is the season to mourn, skeletal and stripped bare. Sleet slips down the globe of the corners of the coffin. The wind that clings and crackles and clears its throat in the eaves is a wind that does not console but only mocks and grieves. Yes, but the winters are mild in the south, which I seem to be unable to leave, but they're colder than you would think. And on the days when the sky never diverges from its essential slate grayness, and the temperature blurs and hovers at freezing, I'm newly convinced the world is burned away wholly and revealed in its absolute miraculousness only between December and February. The constriction in my sternum moves up to the rounded dome of my skull and then back down again, but some of its brittle calcium is converted each time into mercury and light. Winter is the quadrant of the necessary transmogrification, the conversion of loss into life. And now I'm going to read 4 sonnets. I think all of these I've written over the last few years. I don't think many of them follow many of the rules of sonnets, but they're all 14 lines, so I'm going to count them as such. And I don't think I've ever read them all sort of together like this. The first one is named after a song by the 60s band The Box Tops called Soul Deep that Alex Chilton was in. But the line from the song appears in the second to last line of the poem. So this one's called Soul Deep. I wake at 5 a.m. to find all the streetlights in the neighborhood flashing. There's no explanation. No one else sees it. I have no one to share it with. It's so hard to improvise a home and make sure yourself is yourself. Doo-wop floats through the window like blue cotton from another world. My mind is on such intimate terms with tension, it does not know what to do with peace. The darkness isn't a plot device, it's just there, but the light is also. I don't understand it either. My love is a river running soul deep, sing the Box Tops, and I must not scoff at them for telling the truth. This one was a much longer poem that I cut and truncated down and then called it a sonnet again when it got to around 14 lines. And this one's called Long Braid. I love the upturned Cupid's bow of your mouth. I love the picture of you squinting up at the camera. I'm drawn to and repelled by you like I am to certain hours of the day, like I am to my mother's side of the family, like I am to the South itself. Hummingbird instability, magnificent exhilaration, a weather that always hovers close to violence. I'm speaking about love again, as I always am. I'm speaking about limes in the springtime, burnt dresses in the bathtub, gin, vanilla, the long braid of light stitched into the horizon. How do we develop? How do we devour ourselves? How do we endure? And this one is called Anthropocene Sonnet. I'm still not quite sure how you pronounce that word, but I think it's Anthropocene, the era of time that we are living in which the landscape and the earth or environment are affected by humans. So that's what this is called, Anthropocene Sonnet. A certain compression in the shape of the landscape may have choked my feelings. I cannot remember when the restriction began, only remember a subtle divide between what came before and what followed. A fog in the atmosphere against the sharply clarified, unshaded space in the outposts of the dream, which is ending. Doors lose their paneling, and the panoramic view is visible from their windows. Feelings are raw animals that want to hide behind fences. Light pours through open eyes, moves on the face of the water. Riding through the night on my bicycle, I shiver at the absolute limit of my body in the Arctic air. And the last of these semi-sonnets are, this one is a poem for the middle of summer, but I was still going to read it. It's set in August, and it's called August Beasts. Yesterday was the birthday of the band's debut EP release. Today is the birthday of the poet whose approval I wanted but never quite received. He mumbled in a courtly fashion. Virgos are fussy. We are on the cusp of an entirely different curriculum. The first tree is starting to tint orange and yellow. The cicadas are silent again for how many more years? All I want to do is sleep like a luxuriant beast for days and weeks that swap places with each other. Rain again all night again, rain again all day. If I put my foot into the mirror of the puddle, the brace of the vivid cold will shock me awake. I receive a package in the middle of the legitimate mystery of this afternoon. It's ridiculous to believe the world is flat. I can feel it curve away from me as I try to stand here still and calm. And now I'm going to read you 3 poems that mention streets in Athens. The first mentions Barber Street, the second mentions Wilkerson Street, and the third one mentions Washington Street, which I feel like I can almost see from here. So this one is called Barber Street. And when I'm reading other places, I have to explain Athens, but I don't have to explain it to you guys because we're a hometown crowd. Barber Street. It was the boom before the bust. Everybody talked in loose code, hip monosyllables, detached observations. Gin flowed in copious tears. Pinatas got destroyed by vintage Fords the color of fresh blood. Days ran together like sloppy watercolors. You'd wake up morning after a party to find the bartender's cousin asleep on the front porch swing without any pants on. Streamers fluttered, hearts fractured, croquet games flared and fizzled. Everything was lit by electricity. The floorboards shook, furniture got broken, strangers danced themselves unconscious. Don't you see? I loved everyone. And this poem, I wrote this poem a long time ago. It was about the train trestle that was over Wilkerson Street that I think was taken down this summer. So my friend used to live by there, and I think I climbed up to the top of it one day and, ended up writing this poem about that moment and kind of that experience. And then now, like I said, this summer I drove by it and it's gone. So it's, like I said, unexpectedly historical, but it's called Over Wilkerson Street. Half of me wants to throw myself back down to the pavement and shatter my skull like a star or an egg. Half of me wants to keep ascending into the blue sprawl and live there forever, like a transmutated doo-wop singer with a slit throat and missing arm. Instead, to be unable to speak, absolutely in love with something I cannot name, so alive, the unbreathable air around me is a clean white. Oh, sorry. It's a clean white suit. I have this on another page. Stitched together out of light. Sorry. I forgot the second page of the poem. I had to do it from memory. This poem is a longer poem, and about midway through Washington Street shows up. And it's named after the town of Waycross in southern Georgia. It's called Waycross Blues again. Shoehorns, moonlight on the aerosol streets, magazines like white torches, horses prancing, bootleggers trafficking by municipal thoroughfares, band leaders in blue and gold, couples dancing. Georgia in her green shirt sleeves, Georgia all dolled up for summer. I'll be your ragged August Valentine, I'll be your nervous Oriole in the rafters. I can still taste the Louisiana in your mouth, I can still feel you breathing beside me. Lying in bed with a fever, listening for the Victrola, listening for the turn of the key. There were nights we'd get so drunk we'd sleep in other people's yards. On Washington Street, they were fresh as peppermint, wore eyeshadow, were from the suburbs, were almost always blondes. Not one of them was like you at all. Later nights on the road before I met you, I'd lie awake and recite their names in little nursery rhymes, hollowed out incantations. They just did things and forgot about them and did other things. They didn't look for the reasons behind everything. They weren't trying to find God at every intersection and every offhand remark. We can't despair, darling. We can't know it all. Our bodies are so pitiful but so great. Our hearts are so tiny and incorrigible, keeping up their ruthless da-dum against all those unanswerable scenarios, all those slights and fragments. I feel your absence in the library. I feel your absence in Keats' long breath. I'll never understand, and that's all right. I'm taking a walk. I'm going to eat some eggs. I'm a balloon filled with blood. I'm the flame from a Roman candle, scattering the best parts of myself. And I think I'll read maybe two or three more of my poems, and then this longer poem by another poet that's very Christmas related. But this poem, I was lucky enough to attend the last Prince concert, which happened at the Fox Theater in Atlanta 2016. No one knew it was going to be the last Prince concert, but he played 2 shows that night. I had tickets, amazing tickets that I scored. I've had bad luck my whole life getting tickets, but I happened to get good tickets this night. So it was 5th row, really close to the stage. It was just Prince and the piano, and then he was dead a week later. So it took me a long time to really process it and I think finally 3 or 4 years later, I was able to write this poem. This is called The Last Prince Concert, Fox Theater, Atlanta, 2016. April 14th, same night Lincoln got shot and the Titanic hit the iceberg. 4 planets in retrograde, show delayed a week already. cycles of the moon emblazoned across his purple silk pajamas, the scepter he walked with not in affectation, but in affirmation of his majesty, a talisman against the agony in his knees and hips, for which he was taking black market fentanyl, likely during the same astonishing 90 minutes I spent under a faux sky of twinkling yellow stars, listening to him force himself to be vulnerable in front of strangers who were affected by his final strangeness and singularity in ways they could never quite articulate, in ways they would wake up to years later, feeling both an absence and expansion of the world they felt and believed in. Rain that breathes, snow that falls upwards, a new spectrum of color, equal parts light, sound, electric intercourse, and water. And this poem is sort of a sideways kind of elegy also to the musician and the poet David Berman, who also passed away a couple of years ago. I don't think I realized that this was kind of a poem in tribute to him until kind of after I finished it. But it's, like I said, kind of a oblique sideways elegy to David Berman. Slanted blossoms where the angel puked. I don't know how to talk to God. Is she working the door, or is she the door? I'm a flaw in the iris of her flawless hazel eye. The springtime is so perfect, I dream the same thing I wake. I don't know how to talk to God, but I listen to the hiss of passing satellites and the syncopated throbbing in my wrists. Is the world a degraded mirror, or the slanted blossoms of God's bliss? Oh, come let us adore this grass, an angel vomited profusely here in 1763. The minor haunts the major, and the true nightmare is unrelenting consciousness without the grace of dream and sleep. God is just a series of sounds that hold the sandwich of the world together. If I knew her true name, I would pray it in the long honey of the evening and let all else willow into silence. For David Cloud Berman, 1967 to 2019. And the last of my poems that I want to read, I don't really know how this started, but when I was writing a bunch of poems back in the winter of this year, I was trying to write these poems kind of just before I went to sleep, when I could kind of turn off a large part of my brain and see kind of what came out, and then look at it a couple of days later. And some of them ended up being more coherent than others, but there was a weird series of ones. The first one kind of started off as I was writing the poem, and it kind of turned into an acceptance speech from someone getting an award they didn't necessarily want. And then I think the first one took the form of someone who was like a gospel singer getting this weird award, and then the speech kind of went off the rails, and I wrote a few others kind of over the course of a few weeks that took the same format. And this was, I think, the one that ended up being the most shapely and cohesive. So I'll read it with you guys. It's called Gospel Acceptance Speech Number 5. I think there's been a water thread running through this reading, and this poem's about water. So it's called Gospel Acceptance Speech Number 5. I want to dedicate this award to the glass of water I hold in my left hand. It was once in your body, and once in the body of a gray dog in Alsatia, and once in the flesh that hung off the aged Cleopatra, and once in a dense cloud. I'm going to drink this water on stage tonight and ask you to remember its intelligence and versatility, its vast, staggering humility. Ice chokes the blasted hills of Nashville. The songwriter sleeps on a waterbed full of transmogrified jewels that once astonished the ancient city of Alexandria. Water seeks its level and is always returning to the sea. And the last poem I'll read is from a poet called Mary Ruefle, who's actually, I believe, still the poet laureate of the state of Vermont. And I was trying to find good Christmas poems to read you guys from someone else, because I've not written one that's distinctly a Christmas poem. And I looked through ones, and then this was one of the last ones that I found. It seems pretty recent too. I think it was just published in 2016. And it's a prose poem, so be patient with it. She has several things that she kind of works into this poem. but they all come together in a kind of wonderful way at the end. So it's by Mary Ruffo, like I said, and it's called Recollections of My Christmas Tree. I've always been vulnerable when confronted with Christmas decorations, and I'm sitting in my living room staring at them. The lights on the tree are blinking on and off, and I'm mesmerized. I've never been to a hypnotist, but maybe mesmerization is the last state you enter before going over the edge into hypnosis. Maybe being mesmerized is the last thing you remember. It does seem to be a state all its own. When I was a child, I did the same thing. Watched the lights blink on and off, alone in the living room at night. The only difference is I know a lot more about Christmas now than I did then. I knew practically nothing then. My mother put an electric candle in each window. They were ivory-colored plastic, and at the end of each taper, near the bulb, fake drips of rats were modeled. I loved the drips the most. It meant that the candles looked real to people inside the house, not just to people looking at them from the outside. What I didn't know then was that these decorations evolved from the Jewish menorah, the Hebrew Festival of Lights. I don't think my mother knew that either, but if she did, she never mentioned it. And I certainly never contemplated the resemblance of a sleigh to a cradle. A sleigh is basically a very large cradle. The runners of the sleigh are what makes the cradle rock. Once there was a very eccentric man in the 19th century in upstate New York, and when he was in his 50s, he had a carpenter build him a cradle. I saw it in a museum, the biggest cradle ever made, and every night he slept in it. And when he entered his last illness, he stayed in the cradle day and night, feeling the sensual throes of the cradle while somebody nursed and rocked him. I mean in the sense of caring for him. He died in his cradle, and the card on the wall of the museum said he was happy at the end. When I was a child, one of my ornaments was a little red velveteen sleigh. I used to put a tiny doll in it, but now it's empty. I don't even like it anymore. And when I was decorating the tree, I thought about throwing it away, but then I remembered the man in the cradle and decided to keep it. My mother and father also decorated the outside of our house with lights. We lived in a different house every year, so it wasn't easy. The length of the light strings kept changing. People who live in the same house every year don't think about things like that. Their dimensions stay the same. There's no need to adjust anything, ever. After the lights were up on the outside of the house, my father would put us in the car and drive around the neighborhood, looking at the lights on the other houses. Sometimes he made disparaging remarks, and sometimes in silence admired them. When he admired them, he would make changes in his own lights the following year, but as we were by then in a new house, none of the neighbors knew we were copycats. The most beautiful yard we ever saw had a snow scene with a frozen pond in the middle, and life-size figure skaters who floated across the pond wearing muffs. This was in Southern California, so everything was fake. The snow, the frozen pond, even the skaters were fake. And when they moved, you'd hear a slight whir under the ice. I guess it came from a motor. My father couldn't copy that. I could tell from his face that he was defeated. In those days, everyone had lights. Not a single house was without them. That's one thing that has certainly changed. Today, only poor people have lights, and the poorest people of all have the most of them. At least this is true of the town I live in. There's one street that has the poorest people of all, and at Christmas, it's ablaze with lights. There are electric deer on the lawns, huge inflatable Santas. The roofs have more Santas descending in sleighs with reindeers, that kind of thing. The rich people think it's ugly. They don't bother anymore, and they worry about the electric bill. They try to live calm, natural lives. They bake all their own bread. They make cookies and cakes and pies from scratch. They make their own beer and their own wine and liquors, and they grow their own food in the summer. And come winter, when they want a Christmas tree or some holly, they just walk out on their land and cut it. Poor people have to use money. They have to go to the store and buy food, especially the kind that's already made. It didn't used to be that way. When I was a kid, it was understood that poor people had to make everything themselves while rich people got to buy things. My mother bought whole cakes at the grocery store and said we were lucky not to have to make them ourselves. Now everything is reversed. If my mother and father were still alive, they would be very confused. I think we would all become confused eventually if we didn't die. Maybe death prevents a major confusion that would, if it were allowed to go on, eventually kill us all. When I was little, one Christmas ritual majorly confused me. My mother had a little ceramic sleigh that sat on the table. It was driven by a ceramic Santa and pulled by ceramic reindeer. Every year, I had to wrap empty matchboxes so they looked like tiny presents. Then we piled them in the sleigh. They were the presents Santa was hauling. But they were empty, and it made me sad. My mother would sit at the table smoking, watching me wrap the matchboxes. Can't we put anything in them, I asked. No, she said, they're fake. Couldn't we pretend, I said. That's what we're doing, she said. I mean real pretend, I said. But she just stared off into space, and I knew the conversation had ended. One thing is for certain. I wouldn't want to be a Christmas tree. It would be nice to be the center of attention, to be so decorated and lit that people stared at you in wonder and made a fuss over you and were mesmerized. That would be nice. But then you'd start dropping your needles, and people would become bored with you and say you aren't looking so good. And then they'd take off all your jewelry and haul you off to the curb, where you would be picked up and crushed and eventually burned. That's the terrible part. Maybe that's why so many people today have fake trees. They're quite popular. Their limbs come apart, and you can put them in boxes and store them. You can have one of those trees until you die, and you can pass it on to your children. They may not be real. When you look at them, you can't tell the difference. That always makes people happy, not being able to tell the difference. And happiness, to want to be happy, is the most natural thing of all. That man in his big cradle was happy, though I never understood why, when he died. They didn't just saw the runners off and use it as his coffin. I don't think anyone would have noticed. In the end, the difference between a cradle and a coffin is hardly worth mentioning. Though then again, I wouldn't have seen the cradle later in the museum, and if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have kept my red velveteen sleigh. I would have just thrown it away. No, never. When it comes to Christmas, when Christmas comes, I sit firmly on the lap of Charles Dickens and repeat after him, welcome everything. At this well-remembered time, when everything is capable, with the greatest of ease, of being changed into anything, on this day, we shut out nothing. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.